think it's center stage.
So I was thinking about a word to describe your book when I finished reading it, and the only word that came to my mind, and I have to confess that I've never used this word, so I was a little bit uncertain whether to use it now, was magisterial. It's just the scope, the breadth, the authority of the book was just really pretty staggering in terms of what you're covering. And there's lots of wonderful topics that people like me resonate to. The Treasury Accord of 1951, questions about derivatives, all sorts of questions about Bretton Woods, all sorts of issues that about Glass-Steagall, and particular turns and spins on those things that are really pretty interesting in terms of the depth and the capability of thinking about those issues. It turns out I should be careful about using the word magisterial because I had to look it up, and once I looked it up, magisterial means both authoritative and it can mean pedantic. So I don't mean it in the second sense, and I do mean it in the first sense. I would like to just start with something that comes from the opening of your book, and maybe we can talk a little bit about it. It says, far from multinational corporations finding it most convenient to have a world populated by dwarf states or by no states at all, they depend on many states to see to it that these things are done. The American state has played an exceptional role in creation of a fully global capitalism and in coordinating its management as well as restructuring other states to these ends. So I think this gives me a little frame to think a little bit about what you've done here. And I just want to ask you a little bit about what you mean by globalization and why free or freer trade is essential to its achievement, and maybe even what is free enterprise.
Well, in a sense, the book is this long historical analysis that's trying to pierce some myths about globalization. People have tended to treat it on the left and the right as a matter of markets bypassing states, escaping states, deregulation. And we try to show in the book that far from that being the case, the authors of globalization are states. It's not multinational corporations that sign free trade agreements, it's states that do. I guess what we're trying to get at in this neoliberal era, which sees states as opposed to markets, which operates on Ronald Reagan's phrase, governments are the problem, not the solution. We're trying to show the extent to which states, in fact, are primarily oriented to facilitating the expansion and deepening of markets, of capitalist social relations. But then there are states and states, and the Canadian state is not the American state. The American state, to a certain extent, got burdened with the responsibility of ensuring that as many states in the world were open to the free movement of capital, open to free trade, etc. And Dean Acheson in 1939, at the time that that elite was trying to create the conditions that would allow for the United States to go into World War II, went to speak to the International Lady Garment Workers Union. And he said, look, what we've realized is that if Europe doesn't sustain free enterprise, the United States cannot be in free enterprise itself. So if you're looking for a motive for this, that's really what it goes back to.
Mm-hmm. And is there something distinctive about the American state that positions it to do this, where other states either couldn't or wouldn't?
You really have to understand this historically, because if you ask the question of globalization being inevitable, and you looked at the first half of the 20th century, it looked like it was impossible. You have empires that are fragmenting globalization, you've got 2 world wars, you've got a depression, and the question by the Second World War is globalization at all possible? Can you have a global capitalism? And it was only made possible because the American state had the specific capacities to take that on, the specific capacities and the interests. Because you have to remember that after the First World War, the U.S. was already the dominant economic power in the world by far, industrial power. It already was the world's creditor, but it didn't take on this responsibility for the making of a global capitalism. And part of what we're looking at historically is how did it come to see the interests of American capital as linked in with the interests of an open global world for all of capital? How did it develop the confidence and the capacities through the Depression and through the Second World War to take on that project of the making of a global capitalism? And then even as it helps Europe and Japan revive. The question is, how does it keep reproducing this? Because now you're creating your own competitors.
And at one point in your book, you speak about the American empire, actually at a couple of points, and you talk about it as imperialism by invitation. You want to talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, it's actually a phrase that a Swedish historian used for the post-1945 period. But it is largely it's a matter of saying that the Pentagon and the CIA have in fact not been as central to the role the American state has played in the world as the Treasury and the Federal Reserve have been. And the term empire by invitation, which was coined for the way in which the capitalist classes of Europe, after 1945, facing strong labor movements, and much more concerned about those strong labor movements and the socialist threat that they posed than they were concerned about a Soviet invasion, turned to the American state, to look to the American state to reconstruct their capitalist states. And in that sense, it was empire by invitation. When multinational corporations found the conditions by the late 1950s conducive to flow into Europe, that was very much empire by invitation. And the conditions that had been established were the productivity councils that were set up during the 1950s to learn from the way in which American workers had struck a deal, the famous Treaty of Detroit, with the auto companies, whereby they would contribute to productivity growth by not interfering in managerial prerogatives at the workplace, provided they got wage returns equal to, or compensation equal to, that increase in productivity. And that was very much instilled in European labor movements, and that too was empire by invitation. The phrase we ourselves coined, that we're rather proud of, is that Europe went through a process of Canadianization, which we think captures it very well.
And what it gets at is that this is a really different kind of an empire. This isn't an empire that is that spreads through military intervention primarily, through taking over territories, even though obviously the military and the CIA and the Pentagon do play a role. But that what happens on a daily basis in this kind of an empire is that it actually does it through other states. States remain sovereign under this empire. And so this raises this question of, it's a phrase that Leo has developed, the question of the internationalization of other states. How did other states come to take responsibility for global capitalism within their own territory? So on the one hand, it's operating through sovereign states rather than taking them over. And on the other hand, most of the way this operates is through what looks like it's voluntary, because it's markets and institutions, and it's free trade that everybody signs on to, and it's the flow of capital. So it's a very different kind of empire than has ever existed before.
So I'm wondering if we can go back just a little bit and think a little bit about the class dynamics that contribute to this. So, I mean, you make some distinctions between industrial capital and finance capital, and I'd like to think a little bit about how that works both nationally and internationally, and think a little bit about how coherent this class is and how they influence the state. And
Radical political economists, political sociologists in the United States have made a lot of this distinction between industrial and financial capital and the conflicts between them. We don't think that they've proved to be nearly as significant or important either in the United States or elsewhere as radical scholars have claimed them to be. We see much more a confluence of interests, especially in the current era under the leadership of finance. But you're right, I think, that very much central to the theme of the book, and you picked it up with Empire by Invitation, is that one shouldn't look upon the American role in the making of global capitalism as external imposition alone. In fact, maybe not even primarily external imposition. It's as much a process of inside pulling the outside as the outside pushing into the inside of these states. We also don't argue against much of the radical left as well that states are directed by capitalists who know their interests, who come outside of the state to